Left face. Present colors.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Watercolors.
Color guard, please post the colors.
Post national colors. Post remaining colors. Right face. Always march.
Welcome. We are most honored to have a very special guest today, Mr. Clifton Truman Daniel. Please welcome our guest. We're also honored to have Dewey Fry and the Kansas SAR and Missouri SAR Color Guard members and thank them for posting the colors today. In addition, thank you, Deborah Wells Clark, for playing the national anthem on your harp. It was beautiful. Finally, we are honored to have some special Missouri Daughters of the American Revolution with us today. When I call your name, please stand and remain standing. Please hold your applause until the end. Mary Lynn Toll, past NSDAR Vice President General. Cindy Such, past NSDAR Vice President General. Joan McGee, Honorary State Regent. Cindy Williams, State Recording Secretary. Sheila J. Wilson, State Corresponding Secretary. Vera Glenn, Midwest District Director. All current and past chapter regents stand. Thank you so much for coming today. Cindy Williams, the State Recording Secretary, will now send greetings from the State Regent, Lisa Parks.
I am Cindy Williams, MSSDAR State Recording Secretary. On behalf of the Missouri State Regent, it is my privilege to extend heartfelt gratitude to the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library and Museum and to the Fort Osage Chapter, NSDAR, for sponsoring this remarkable event. We are confident that Mr. Clifton Truman Daniel's insights will inspire and deepen our connection to our shared history. Missouri Daughters are proud to celebrate our nation's heritage and the enduring legacy of the Truman family.
Little mishap. Thank you, Cindy Williams. The chair of today's program, Christine Hughes, will now present the guest speaker.
I really don't need notes, you know. Do I? Good to have. During World War II, my father was a prisoner of war in Stalag 4 in Poland for 349 days. Early in the spring of 1945, when the Russian army was advancing into Poland, the Nazis moved the prisoners into Germany on a march, which would result in the death of over 1,400 of the prisoners. They died of starvation, sickness. My father survived, came home, got married, and had 7 children. And I'm the second oldest. My father had the deepest respect and gratitude for President Truman's leadership, which helped bring an end to World War II. My story is just one of many stories which probably some of you could tell as well. It is a great honor and a privilege to present President Truman's oldest grandson, Clifton Truman Daniel, who will share his stories with us today. Thank you.
Okay. Let me turn this thing on and see if it's working. Yay, I dropped it, so you never know whether you've just shot yourself in the foot. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Nice to see you all here at the Truman Library. I will start, and thank you, Christine, for that nice introduction. I will start by saying that I'm delighted to know that my great Aunt Mary Jane was a member of the chapter, and I'm glad that the library now knows that. Apparently that was not a foregone conclusion. But I have to tell you that great Aunt Mary Jane and I did not know each other well, did not see each other very often. And I think that's because she and my grandfather was their brother, John Vivian Truman, lived their own lives. They had a president of the United States in the family, but that did not swell their heads one bit. In fact, my great-grandmother, their mother, Maddie Truman, when she first went to the White House in 1946, everybody made a big fuss. There were limousines, planes, cars, guards, guys in uniform, and she at one point said, I don't know if I'm quoting her exactly, but she said, "Well, fiddlesticks. If I'd known this was all going to happen, I'd never have come." So they lived their own separate, quiet. They liked their lives just the way they were, farm families, and it wasn't that big a deal to them that their brother was president of the United States. I did not know at first that my grandfather had been president of the United States. My mother failed to tell me. I found out in school. Thank God it was first grade and not sixth. We went around the room, the teacher went around the room and asked each of us to stand up, introduce ourselves, and say a little something about our families. And apparently when it came to my turn, I just stood up and said, "Clifton," and sat back down. And she said, "Wait a minute, wait, whoa. Wasn't your grandfather president of the United States?" And my brilliant reply was, I don't know. I'll go home and ask. And I did, and my mother loved to tell this story almost until the day she died. She would tell this story on me. I went home that afternoon, I dropped my book bag at the front door, and I marched across the living room to where my mother was sitting, and I stood in front of her and put my hands on my hips, and I said, "Mom, did you know?" And she said, "Yes, but just remember something. Any little boy's grandfather can be president. Don't let it go to your head." It didn't. It went right over my head. I had no idea what that meant. I was 6 years old. I had no idea what president meant. Up until that time, Grandpa came around every once in a while. He came to visit us early in my life in New York. In fact, he and my grandmother came right after I was born. They came to see the first grandchild. And there's a picture somewhere of the both of them staring in the window at me in my little bassinet. So they came to New York, and I have to, it's a point of pride with me that I can say to you that I am the only person living who has peed on Harry Truman. My mother handed me to him, and he said, "Oh, that's so nice. Whoa, this child's wet." They came, my grandfather took off shortly thereafter. I'm not sure because of what I did, but he had somewhere else to go. My grandmother stayed, and my grandmother had, my mother was their only child, and she had 2 miscarriages before my mother was born. So the tradition was, in that day and age, you don't get all the baby clothes, you don't get the cribs, you wait until everything is okay. So my mother, of course, spent the first night of her life in the dresser drawer on some blankets. This carried over to me even in 1957. They didn't buy anything. I didn't wind up in the dresser drawer, but they didn't buy anything, didn't buy crib, clothes, anything. So my father had to go out and get a crib, which he had to put together. Now, my father, though he was at the top of his career, the managing editor of the New York Times, was not handy. His idea of a toolkit in our apartment in New York was a cream pitcher with 2 screwdrivers in it. So he's putting together this crib, and he is pinching his fingers and banging his thumbs, and my grandmother stayed, and she was sort of supervising, watching this whole thing. And Dad is hurting himself repeatedly, and he's swearing under his breath. And my grandmother finally touched him on the shoulder and said, "Just go ahead and say it out loud. It's not like I hadn't heard it before." So they were there for my birth, but Grandpa, they came around every once in a while after that. And when Grandpa came to visit in New York, you either accorded him a great deal of respect, or you got out of his way. You avoided him. Because if he could catch you, he would teach you something. He came to visit us early on in my life. They stayed, both of them stayed down the street at the Carlisle Hotel, which was less than a block from our apartment. My mother used to live at the Carlisle when she was pursuing a singing and acting and celebrity career in New York. She had an apartment there. So she and Dad moved not even a block away. So Grandpa stayed at the Carlisle, and he got up every morning at 5 or 5:30. He kept farmer's hours, military hours all of his life. So he was up at the crack of dawn. He went for a 1 or 2 mile walk at a military pace, 120 steps a minute. He often said that anything more than a mile walk didn't do a man over 40 any good. So he went for a walk. He came back to the hotel. He ate breakfast, and he grabbed as many newspapers as he could get his hands on. Back in the day in New York, you had 4 or 5 newspapers. And Grandpa would tuck this whole mess under his arm and walk up the block and let himself into our apartment with the spare key that my mother had given him. And he would come into the living room, and he'd throw all this mess on the floor and open a paper and read until somebody woke up. That didn't happen for a while in my house. We didn't get up at 5:30 in the morning. And my younger brother William and I were the first ones up one morning, and we came downstairs, and we saw what looked like the New York Times with legs. It was just sitting in the living room. And we knew who it was, so we started to tiptoe past him to get to the den where they kept the television set. And he caught us. And he said, "Where do you think you're going? Into the den, watch TV? You don't want to do that." Yes, I do. That's why we were tiptoeing. And he said, I have a much better idea. And he walked between us into the den. He took a book from the top shelf. And he said, you come on out here and sit down. We're going to read. You didn't argue with Harry Truman. So we sat down by Grandpa on either side of him, and he opened the book and he started to read. And my mother came downstairs just a few minutes later and stopped cold at the bottom of the steps. She'd never seen anything like this in her life. My brother and I were sitting stone still on either arm of the easy chair while Grandpa read to us from a book that didn't have any pictures in it at all. And she said, what are you reading to them? And he held up the book so she could see it. It was Thucydides, the history of the Peloponnesian War, to a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old. Years later and years ago, when I turned 40, I went home to visit my mother, and I had some time in the early evening, and I said, is that book still up there? And she said, oh yeah, top shelf, you can see it right there. I said, okay. And I went and got a glass of white wine, and I got the book. And I said, you know, if the man wanted me to read it when I was 4, the least I could do is read it when I'm 40. And I opened it up. I got a page and a half through that book, and I drank the wine. That's tough reading. But for Grandpa, that was it for him. You all know that he read all of his life. His education past high school was all self-taught. His press secretary, well, no, it's Dean Acheson, actually, his Secretary of State. He and Dean Acheson once, I think Grandpa said that he and Charlie Ross had read every single book in the Independence Public Library, about 2,000 books. And he'd been through the big old family Bible 2 or 3 times. And Dean Acheson then bumped that up to, I think, 5,000 books. It was an election year, he was inflating. So, but reading was very important to him. He read if I ever wanted to find Grandpa when I was here in Independence, you found him in the den with a book open in front of him. So he probably thought I was a little behind in my Thucydides by the time I was 4 years old. And he started that started very young for him. When he was 6, his parents took him to a 4th of July celebration in Independence, and at the end of the day when the fireworks were going off, they're going off over here, and Grandpa was looking over here somewhere. And my great-grandmother took him to the doctor after that, and the doctor diagnosed what they called then flat eyeballs. He was farsighted. And I don't quite know how that works because the fireworks were far away, but anyway, he had trouble seeing the fireworks. She took him to the doctor the next day, and they gave him thick glasses, which he wore for the rest of his life. So it slowed him down in the schoolyard and on the playing field, but it opened the whole world to him at the tips of his fingers. And his mother didn't give him a comic book. I mean, I was at the age of 6 and 9, I was reading Archie comics, for goodness sake. The first present that he remembers her giving him, I think he was 9 or 10 years old, was a 4-volume set called Great Men and Famous Women. Essays about movers and shakers written by serious writers and journalists of the day. 4 books, each one of them a doorstop. Those are still in the Truman working office on the shelf in there. So reading, very important to Grandpa. I discovered it about the same time that, actually it was a little earlier, the man who came up with the Marshall Plan, the end of the war in Japan, NATO, Point 4, aid to Greece and Turkey, all of that stuff, was a terrible babysitter. The first time he babysat us, I think I was 2 and my brother was 1. I was almost 3 and he was very little. And my parents left the country to go on a trip, and they left my grandparents in charge. And the last thing my mother said to him before she went out the door was, "Don't you let all those photographers out on the street take the children's pictures." And he said, "No, of course not. I wouldn't do that." She goes out the front door, he turned around, picked us both up, put us in the window. And you may have seen the pictures. Both of us are pressed up against the glass. And here's Grandpa behind us smiling. Look! So terrible babysitter. Also, a couple of years later, about the same time of the Thucydides debacle, I had one of those hobby horses. Big, thick plastic. It's on a wooden stand. It's got springs at the knees and the front and back. And you can ride it forward and back and side to side. Well, apparently I was a little rough with it. And my mother was always telling me, slow down, you're going to hurt yourself. You can kill yourself on that thing. She wasn't around one morning. I was with my grandparents, and Grandpa was back behind the New York Times, sitting in the dining room this time, paying no attention to me at all. And so I thought, good, and I rode that horse as hard as I could, and I had it lifting up off the floor, and it landed wrong, and I went flying. And my grandmother heard the commotion. She was in the kitchen. And she heard the commotion, and she came running out, and she saw me sprawl on the floor. And ladies in the room, when you see your grandmother running towards you, what's the first thing you do? Cry, burst into tears, because it's good for a cookie, isn't it? So I burst into tears, and my grandmother came to scoop me up, and right before she got to me, a voice from across the room goes, "Stop right there, don't you touch him." And I looked up to see who ruined this for me. And there's Grandpa glaring at me over the top of the paper. And he said, you're not hurt. Quit crying. I shut up immediately. He said, get that contraption up, get on it, and start riding it again. I got the horse up. My grandmother held me. She dusted me off, all cleaned up. She went back in the kitchen, he went back behind the paper, and I rode very carefully. Until I figured it was safe to get off and get out of there. Turned out, Grandpa was a lot nicer to me than his own father, John Truman, was to him. When Grandpa was 6, he had a pony that his father had gotten, and he'd ride it around the house, the acreage here in Independence, and he fell off. One day, just sort of slipped out of the saddle. And John Truman said, any boy that can't stay on a pony when it's walking deserves to walk himself. And made him walk back to the house. But at least I got to get back on. But as I said, I had no idea what President of the United States meant when I was 6. I had to wait a whole year until I was 7 before it began to sink in. And the occasion was President Johnson's inauguration in January 1965. They had invited my grandparents, but at that point Grandpa was 81, my grandmother was 80, and they said, back to Washington, what fun. And so they declined, and they sent my mother in their place as their representative, and Mom took Dad and me and my brother with them. And just as an aside, the Johnsons and my grandfather and my grandparents had a very good relationship. In fact, LBJ came to this very stage to sign the Medicare Act and gave my grandparents the first 2 cards. Wow. Mine, I think my card is 2,568,XZY. So they had a close relationship. It only suffered one glitch in, I think it was in 1965 or maybe even a little earlier. Mrs. Johnson and Mrs. Kennedy called my grandmother. They wanted to rehang her official White House portrait in the White House, rehang it. And they said, well, we can't find it. And my grandmother said, that's because it's on my wall. And Mrs. Johnson said, well, you can't do that. That belongs to the American people. And my grandmother said, hell, it does. It's a picture of me, and it's on my wall. That's what it's going to say. So Mrs. Johnson didn't waste another breath arguing with my grandmother. She called the artist, Greta Kempton, and had 2 copies made. One copy is in the White House collection. The other is outside on a wall right outside here if you want to look at it. The original is still on my grandmother's wall. Her original portrait is still at the Truman home. So that was the only bump in the road that the Johnson and Truman family suffered. I'm still friends to this day with Lucy and Linda Johnson. I keep calling them the Johnson girls, but they're both like 10 years older than I am. I'm probably going to have to refer to them in some other way. The last time I saw them, we went down to Jimmy Carter's 100th birthday, riding in a car with Massey McKinley, who was President McKinley's great-great-nephew and President Cleveland's great-great-grandson. We call him double whammy. 2 presidents. So anyway, my mother takes us to Washington, and we stay in Blair House across the street from the White House, the nation's guest house, which is where, as you all know, my grandparents lived from early 1949 to about March of 1952. So almost his whole second administration, they lived in Blair House. The White House at that point was falling apart. Now, I did a speech on the restoration of the White House years ago. And I originally had it, I called the White House Historical Association. I said, I've got an idea for this speech. I want to do a speech about every president that ruined the White House for my grandparents. Dug in the walls, put in lights, put in gas, made a whole mess of the thing. And they laughed and they said, oh, that'd be great. No. There's only two presidents you can blame. You can blame Teddy Roosevelt, you can blame Calvin Coolidge. And the reason is Teddy Roosevelt wanted a bigger state dining room down by where the old west staircase was. He knocked out a load-bearing wall and the staircase. And they hung the second floor from the roof above. There used to be a girder in the wall above the state dining room, holding, so it's a hammock. And then Calvin Coolidge came along about 20 years later and had to redo the third floor, used cement. So now you have an ice cream cake. It's just melting and sagging. Cracks began to appear almost immediately. My mother used to remember that when a color guard came across the eastern floor, the chandeliers were quivering. And we were talking earlier, Grandpa had a concert by pianist Eugene List in the East Room. And at the start of the concert, they're all getting ready to warm up, and the engineers came to my grandfather and said, that chandelier is hanging by a thread. What do you want to do? And Grandpa took a chance. He let the concert go on. And I think he said, I'll let the concert go on, but if it had fallen, I'd have been in real trouble. So the White House was in bad shape. The last straw was when the leg of my mother's piano in her sitting room on the second floor punched through the floor and lowered the ceiling in the family dining room below it 1.5 feet. Broke a beam. I think the beam is in the other room too. So you have an assignment after this. You have to go look at the portrait, go look at the beam. So that they've got that. So that was when they ordered everybody out and completely gutted the White House from the inside out, took it down to the original stone walls, rebuilt it with a steel superstructure on the inside. And that's how it stands today. They did a whole bunch of other work underground and whatnot. Well, my grandparents were, of course, living over at Blair House for that entire time. David McCullough, in the book Truman, had an interesting story about their time in Blair House. My grandmother was always accused of not liking Washington, maybe not even liking my grandfather, because she used to go back and forth to Independence all the time. It was because of her mother. Madge Gates Wallace needed my grandmother, and so she was constantly tugging on her to come back home. And she'd get back here, and then Grandpa would start pulling in the other direction, so she'd go back to Washington. While they were living in Blair House, my grandmother had been gone for a couple of months, so they'd been apart for a while, and they didn't like that much. They were a close couple. But when she came back, the mood just brightened. I mean, they were so happy to see each other that it translated to everybody else in the house. All the staff, everybody was in a good mood. And the next morning, my grandmother came down to the head usher, Mr. Fields, and she said, there's an issue, oh hell, Fields, one of the slats on our bed is broken. Really more than I wanted to know about my grandparents. So they had that time over in Blair House. But anyway, back to President and Mrs. Johnson. We stayed at Blair House. My mother was the hostess there were 4 inaugural balls that year. My mother was the hostess for the one at the Mayflower Hotel. And protocol, I don't know if it still dictates this, but protocol in those days was that the president goes to all of these parties. And the first thing he's supposed to do is dance with the hostess. Well, my mother was behind a railing on the side of the ballroom, and there were people packed all around her, so she couldn't, the railing wasn't, it was just an ornamental kind of thing, but she couldn't get around it. There were people all around her. Well, LBJ didn't have time for all this nonsense, so he simply reached over the railing, grabbed my mother under the arms, and hauled her out. Big man, LBJ. There were people helping. There were pictures. I thought the way my mother described this to me the first couple of times was that it was like a ballet. He just reached in and lifted her up, and she floated over the I've seen pictures. There are arms and legs all over the place. People are holding one leg, trying to get her over here, helping the president. And he danced off with her, and that was all fine and dandy. But then at the end of this exercise, he handed her off to Vice President Humphrey so he could dance with everybody else. And when it came time to put Mom back, Vice President Humphrey did not waste any muscle or thought on this at all. He put a chair in front of that railing and held her hand while she walked herself. So before we left the next day, we were invited to have breakfast at the White House with the Johnsons. And of course, in those days, when I traveled, my parents put us in a coat and tie. I mean, we were dressed to get on the train to go home. So everybody was dressed. And we're going to the White House. It'd be nice that we. But Mom she'd been out the night before. She'd been out late. She'd had fun. She was very grumpy in the morning. So she's pushing the comb through her hair, and I straighten the tie, sit up straight, I'm trying to get there. We're going over to the White House to say, behave yourself. And so we're like, tension, tension, tension. We get over to the White House, and the elevator opens on the second floor, and there's Lady Bird Johnson in her nightgown. And all I could think was, I had to get all dressed up. Why didn't she? She's got a canary yellow nightgown, canary yellow dressing gown over it, canary yellow slippers, every hair in place, by the way. Makeup on, the whole 9 yards. And I said to my mother as we walked past, I said, I know Mrs. Johnson's a lot older than you are, but she has a lot more pep this morning. Where does a 7-year-old get that? I'm thinking watching too many cornflakes commercials. And my mother, I was lucky I was in the White House because she really couldn't hit me. So she said under her breath, very dangerously, go in a corner, get your brother, and sit down and be quiet. So that's what we did. We sat on a chair in the corner together. The president came out in his pajamas and his bathrobe and his slippers, and he went right past my parents and plunked himself down from the two of us. Hi, boys. How you doing? You having a good time? Good, good, good. Do you like the Beagles? We met him and her, the Beagles, the day before. And we said, yes, sir. And he said, listen, I understand one of you's got a paper to write. That was me, the second grader, who had, the teacher lets you go to something, you have to write a paper about it if you're missing school. So I said, yes, sir. And he said, well, you're going to need proof that you were here, aren't you? Okay. And he got up and he left. And he came back a few minutes later with everything he could find that had his name on it. Stationery, envelopes, pens, and he started making souvenir piles. When a lady will out, he didn't have to write a paper, so he's making a pile. In the middle of this exercise, Lady Bird Johnson reached across the table and snatched something out of his hand and said, Lyndon, for God's sake, you cannot give them those. He tried to give us each a book of White House matches. White House, Lyndon Johnson, strike here. Years later, I gave this speech to the Johnson Presidential Library in Austin, Texas. And Lady Bird Johnson was in the front row with Lucy and a bunch of the grandchildren. And I drank all my water. I sweated through my suit because I'm telling a nightgown story on this lady. And she's looking right at me. And we had dinner with the Johnson family up on the 7th floor of the library afterwards. And during the meal, as we all sat down, Mrs. Johnson reached over and tapped on her glass, and she said, I would like to give Clifton a little something for coming and speaking to us this evening. And she said, hold out your hand. And I thought, does she have a ruler under the table? And so I stuck my hand out, and into it she dropped 2 books of matches. She said, I hope you are old enough to have these now. I was 35 at the time, so that's debatable. Those were actually LBJ Ranch matches, because she couldn't, at short notice, she couldn't get a hold of White House matches. But years later, it was only just a few years ago, Lucy came to do a program for the Truman Library, and she brought White House LBJ matches for me, and pens, and all sorts of, and she starts doing what her father did, one for you, and another one for you. So I finally got my White House matches. Anyway, during this exercise in the White House, My father looked at his watch and said, "Mr. President, we should probably go. We have a train to catch." And President Johnson said, "Oh, Cliff, relax. The train will wait." And my father said, "For you? We're going to wait for us." "Oh, sit down, you have plenty of time." So Dad did. Sat down, lost track of time, looked at his watch again, bolted to his feet, and said, we need to get going." "Oh, fine, come again when you stay a little longer." Down in the elevator, down to the lower level, running out the back, diving into the limousine that they had for us. And they took us to Union Station, and on the way over to the station, my parents started the parental argument. "Well, what are we going to do now? We're going to miss the train. It's after 10 o'clock. It's gone. You want to fly?" "No, I do not." "Well, when's the next train?" So back and forth. Nobody really noticed that the train did not go to the front of Union Station. It went around back. The car went around back and pulled in onto a train platform. And the only people on the train platform were a red cap, a porter with a baggage cart, and standing next to him was a conductor with his watch out. And behind them was a train. My dad didn't even ask if it was the right train. He just started throwing his bags at the red cap. And the conductor said, folks, slow down, relax. You have plenty of time. The White House called. President Johnson had stopped the train. And that's when it hit me. My grandfather could stop trains. And I'm sure that I got a big fat head about that, and I was probably insufferable for weeks afterwards, telling every kid in school, "Hey, what does your grandfather do?" "Really? Mine could stop trains." And I went to school with Chip Cronkite, Walter Cronkite's kid. So I'm like, "Yeah, what's your dad?" "Always on television." You know. So anyway, my grandfather would have been appalled at that, because as my mother said to me when I was 6, "Don't let it go to your head." And that's the way we were raised. You do not let it go to your head. Now, it's public service, it's an honor, and you don't, I don't know if his grandpa that said it, but maybe it was him. He said some people go into government and grow, the rest of them just puff up. So you have to be very careful when you are in public service. He took it very seriously. He always looked at the White House and the presidency. First of all, it terrified him. He famously said, "I felt the sun, moon, and all the planets had fallen on me, that I had a job to do, and I did it." And when he left, he put it all aside. He did not take the ego back home with him. He once said one of his favorite early heroes, was Cincinnatus of Rome. And Cincinnatus, probably some of you know the story. I probably know it better if I'd read all the Thucydides. But Cincinnatus was called to save Rome, I think twice, lead the legions of Rome to save the state. And after he was done, he went home. And they offered him the laurel wreath. They said, "Be Caesar, be the king." "Nope, thank you, I've done my job. I'm going back to my farm, my vineyards," which he did. And that's what Grandpa did. After he left the White House, he went home, went back to independence. He had a little tiff with Eisenhower on the way. They didn't speak to each other in the car on the way to the inauguration. When Grandpa went to the train station, he and my grandmother went to the station. There were a couple of thousand people there to see them off, which was nice, at Union Station. And when they got to Kansas City, there were more than that. There were 2 or 3 times that many to greet them here in Kansas City. And a reporter asked my grandfather right off the bat, "Mr. Truman, what's the first thing that you are going to do in retirement?" And my grandfather said immediately, "Take the suitcases up to the attic." He retired after that. He had an office in downtown Kansas City. He did correspondence. He worked on his memoirs with the staff that he hired to help him with that, and they started working on plans to build the Truman Library. But he just kept to work. He did not do what presidents do these days, the good ones, as well as the other ones. He did not take advantage of the post-presidency. He didn't get $100,000 for speeches. He didn't write books. So he wrote the memoirs, but that was pretty much it. He was offered seats on boards of banks and businesses, one paying him $100,000 a year in 1953. But he refused all of that because he said, they do not want Harry Truman. What they want is the presidency, and that is not for sale. So he retired quietly, wrote his memoirs, worked on the library. There are some things that he would not do as a private citizen. Early on in his retirement, I think it was the first spring, 1953, my grandmother looked out the window and she said, "Harry, the grass is getting kind of leggy. You need to mow the lawn." And he said, "I hate mowing the lawn." And she said, "Yeah, I know, but you're not president anymore, buddy. No one's cutting your grass for you." He said, all right, I'll get to it." He didn't. She nagged him a little bit more, said, "Come on." And he goes, yeah, I've got it on my list. Didn't do it. "Come on, cut the grass." Yeah. Almost there. He finally goes out one morning, rolls up his shirt sleeves, goes back to the shed, gets the mower, and goes at the lawn. And my grandmother looked out the window and nearly died. It was Sunday morning. People in town are going past the house on their way to church. And here is the former President of the United States pointedly not going to church and cutting the grass instead. And waving to everybody who went by so they would notice this. And my grandmother ran out there and she yanked the mower handle out of his hand. She said, "Don't you ever do that again." He said, "Okay." I got a call years ago. I got a call from the Truman Library, and they said, "Would you write a letter of congratulations to a 93-year-old gentleman who has just retired as the lay minister of his church?" And I said, "Sure. Give me a little background. What's the family connection?" And they said, "Well, he used to cut your grandfather's grass." So not only did Grandpa use the church to get out of cutting the grass, he turned around and hired clergy to do it for him. He also, when he retired, and most of you probably know this, he did not have Secret Service protection for the first 10 or 11 years of his retirement. It wasn't until after JFK was assassinated that they got a Secret Service detail. He had Mike Westwood, who's a retired. Neil, do you remember, is he retired Kansas City or Independence? Mike Westwood. Independence? Thank you. Thank you, John. By the way, I'll just point out that there are 3 of us in the room who play Harry Truman on stage. I'm one of them. The other 2 are sitting right there. So we're going to have a dueling Truman. That's Neil Johnson and John Pritchard. We were taking pictures outside by Grandpa's statue as we started, and people were asking, "Is that the right height?" And I'm saying, "No, I'm about the same size as he was." They've augmented Grandpa a little bit, and I think John said, "Oh, good, he's getting closer to my height. We're in good shape." Anyway, now where the heck was I? Anyway, in retirement, presidents were much more accessible than they are today. They didn't live in gated communities. My grandfather just lived in Independence. Went for his morning walks. Greeted people, moved around freely, but there was no protection. The front gate, that fence, that 5-foot steel fence that Secret Service put in to protect the house when he was president, the front gate's unlocked. And I'll leave you with this story. And this was again early in the 1950s after he retired, a man was driving by the house and his car broke down on Delaware. And he didn't know where he was. There's this nice big Victorian house, but there's a sign out that says Truman Home. Not in that day. There wasn't any sign out front. So he walked through the front gate and walked up to the door and rang the doorbell. And my grandfather answered the door. And he said, "Can I help you?" The man said, "My car broke down. I'm sorry to bother you. Can I use your phone? I need to call a garage." And the man said, and Grandpa said, "Yes, come in. That's terrible." He let the man use the phone in the front hall, and the man called the local garage, and the guy said, "Well, I'll be out there as quick as I can." The man said, "Thank you." And after he hung up, he and Grandpa stood in the front hall of the Truman home and just talked about cars, probably, and because Grandpa loved driving, he loved cars. They probably, complaining about glitchy cars and what was going on, what was wrong with it. Well, finally, the guy from the garage arrived out front. And the man shook my grandfather's hand and he said, "Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate the help. It's been nice talking to you." Grandpa said, "It's been nice talking to you too. I hope that doesn't cost you too much money." And the man turned around and he got halfway down the front steps and he stopped. And he turned around and he said, "You know something? And I hope you don't take offense at this. but you look a hell of a lot like that SOB Harry Truman. And Grandpa apparently just smiled at it and said, well, you know something? And I hope you don't take offense, but I am that SOB. Do we have time for some questions? Should I do that? Okay. Questions, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, good. Nobody has any. All right. Yes.
So where do you live?
I live in Chicago. I was born and raised in New York at that apartment where Grandpa tried to educate me. Lived there for 26 years, when 15 years in North Carolina in the interim, working for a New York Times paper. Met my wife there, got married there. All my children were born in North Carolina. You would never know it now. They're all Chicago kids, city kids through and through. I've been in Chicago for the past 26 years. So, my wife's originally from the Chicago suburbs. So, the timing was good. I think when we moved, they were 8, 10, and a little more than 0, 1 year old. And that's it. No. Well, I gotta think of another story now. Nobody has any questions. Look at they're all. Oh, Neil. Oh, this is great. Oh, this is just like school.
Well, before you were born, 1948, September 18th, my dad and I went down to Rock Island Depot to hear your grandfather speak, first time of the hour of the day, and he spoke to Lewis, to Tom Dooley.
I heard that.
So my dad says, well, if you want to see a live president, we better go down there and hear Truman. So we did. And of course he won. That was a very important day for him. Went out to Dexter, Iowa, 90,000 farmers at a national
Yes.
contest. And got the farm vote in 48. Now, he was wrong about him losing to Dewey, but he was right about taking us down there to see the live president, and he got us another term. He also was offered a third term.
He had enough. I mean,
the last one,
who wants that job?
who ran for a third term. I won't talk about the present one, but
Yeah, let's be careful. That bit, that Dexter, Iowa bit is in the play Give 'Em Hell Harry that I do on stage. And Playing Your Own Grandfather is the weirdest retirement program anybody has ever done. But there's that scene in the play where he says, I remember the morning we pulled into Dexter, Iowa. It's a tiny town, normally about 200 souls live in Dexter, but it was the site of the national plowing competition that year. And when we pulled into that station, there were 97,000 farmers waiting for us. 97, and all I could think was, it was 5 o'clock in the morning, milking time. And all I could think was, you get 97,000 farmers together at milking time, everywhere else you're going to have a hell of a lot of nervous cows. Followed by a run on buttermilk. But yeah, that's in the play. You know, Sam Galoo did a good job with that play.
Did he actually walk every day from the house on Delaware to here?
No, I don't think so. He did a morning walk. And he may have driven down here. He could have walked some days. One of my favorite stories is that after the library was built and he had his working office out here. And by the way, my grandmother, when he was laying out the library, he told her where the grave sites are, as you all know, in the middle of the library. And she said, why'd you do that? And he said, well, because after I'm gone, if I feel like working, I can just get up and walk the 50 feet to my office. She did not think that was funny. One of the first days that he was down here in his office, he realized that he was less than a mile from home, so he walked home for lunch. And he walked in the front door, and my grandmother went, good God, what are you doing here? And he said, I thought I'd come home for lunch. And she said, listen, you haven't been home for lunch in 35 years. You're not going to start now. She had things to do. I think she made him a sandwich and sent him back here.
But he didn't have sidewalks from.
Well, I did not know that. That solves the question about whether he walked. I mean, he did walk back up. I know he went to the house at least at one time before she kicked him out. But I don't think he walked around the neighborhood.
Okay.
So he went for those walks. Somebody had a question back there. Yes, sir.
In 1917, was he drafted? How did he get into the military and the artillery?
He was not drafted. He was a member of the Missouri National Guard, and he enlisted. Upset my grandmother, but he enlisted and helped form a new unit, which got him elected lieutenant. Those were still in the days, the First World War, you could still vote for your officers. So he was elected lieutenant, and by the time he was sent to France, he'd been promoted to captain and put in charge of the infamous Battery D. A bunch, mostly hard drinking, hard living, very educated Irish Catholics, with a couple of Germans thrown in for good measure. But a good group once he got them straightened out. But yeah, that's how he always wanted a military career. He wanted to go to West Point early in his life, but his eyesight and kept him out. So he joined the National Guard first in 1905, 1906, and quit in 1910 because the farm was too much for him to handle and go to and drill with the Guard. So and then he rejoined in 1917, went overseas in 1918. The chateau where he was billeted, when he learned, because he had to learn to use the French 75 artillery pieces, because this was new to him. And he stayed at a chateau over there, and the friend of ours now owns that chateau, and she built a Truman Grove. And there's a plaque the library held her. And Cassie Pekarsky of the Truman Library Institute found her a gun, found her a French 75. It's at the Museum of the Marine Corps in Virginia. And it needs some work because it's a 1926 model and it has rubber tires. Because by that time they were pulling them behind trucks, not horses. So it has to be re-outfitted with wagon wheels, and they have to recreate what's called the splinter shield, that thing that goes on the gun here to protect the crew from the blowbacks. But we found her a gun. We're trying to we might get it over there by the fall next year. So and then they'll put it out there in that grove. So that'll be nice. It's a beautiful, beautiful chateau.
That reminds me, I was a historian at the Rock Island Arsenal, and excuse me, I'm getting old.
Really?
But I remember that came from the Rock Island Arsenal, that replacement for a 75 millimeter gun, and I've been a historian there for about 8-9 years. So that kind of rang bells.
Yeah.
I saw that they had a replacement more up to date, I guess. So, yeah, some of these things
tough to
bring
find.
back memories.
Yeah.
We're 93, there's a lot to remember.
Yeah, I imagine there is. In the beautiful hat, you had a question.
I heard that he used to tease his mother when she came to the White House and said he would fix her up a place in the Lincoln bedroom, and she said she'd sleep on the porch first.
You are almost correct. That was not my grandfather. That was my mother.
Your mother? Okay.
Taking a pot shot at her grandmother.
Okay.
In the limousine from the airport or from the air base back to the White House, my mother said exactly that. Grandma, we got the Lincoln bedroom all fixed up for you.
Yeah.
Family unreconstructed Southerners.
Right.
Although Solomon Young has sworn an oath of loyalty to the Union, their farm was raided 4 or 5 times, hogs slaughtered, silver stolen. They hanged my great-great-uncle Harrison several times to get him to tell them the whereabouts of his older brother who had joined the Confederacy. They've never forgiven. In fact, the first time that my grandfather went out to the farm in his new National Guard uniform in 1906, his grandmother said, "Harry, that is the first time a blue uniform's been in here since the war. Don't you dare bring it in here again." And Maddie did in fact say to my mother, "Well, if there's no other place to sleep, I'll take the floor."
Yeah.
She was not going to sleep in the Lincoln bedroom. Grandpa was the only one in his family that liked Abraham Lincoln. And he had to keep quiet about it too. Yes?
Before you were born, in the early 50s, evidently your grandfather was a big proponent of entertainment for all, a outdoor theater in Rock Creek Park.
Okay.
Do you know
You learn something every day in this job. I did not know that.
Okay. And they put on a play, I can't remember, it was something about our founders. It ran for at least 2 years. And I know your grandfather supported it. People from the universities around played the roles. I did find some things a couple of years back here, but I just wondered if you knew whether I think your mother did it, Sharon.
She could have. She was the performer in the family at that point. She started singing lessons when she was 12 or 13 years old, and Grandpa supported that. Only once did he not support it. Somebody asked him when he was president, "What do you think of your daughter's singing career?" And he said, "Frankly, I'd rather have grandchildren." He only did it once. But yeah, she was the performer in the family, and she was a good singer and a good actor. I saw her in dinner theater in New Jersey when I was 9 or 10 years old, and I remember being stunned that my mother could act, because all she ever did was yell at me. Well, folks, I think, in the back, a man in uniform. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Kind of want to make his grandson the grandson, because my grandfather served 1910 to 1918 in the Kansas National Guard, and he spoke of meeting your grandfather as they delivered munitions in France.
Nice.
His bunch delivered to your grandfather's artillery.
Well, I'm sure that my grandfather appreciated that.
I don't think my granddad did.
Well, there's that the story of course, Battery D. Once he got them whipped into shape, their first engagement was not nothing to write home about, because the Germans drew a bead on them while they were firing and started lobbing shells back, and one of the sergeants got spooked and ran. And men started going with him. He's like, "They got a beat on us, boys, run for it." And they took off. And at that point, Grandpa launched into a tirade of profanity just to get them back up there. And there was a man in another unit nearby. I think we talked about this last night. There was a man in another unit nearby. I don't think it was your grandfather, but he said after he overheard this string of obscenity, and he said afterwards, "That was the most artful use of profanity I have ever heard." And Grandpa got them back up there, and the ones who ran, and the sergeant ones who ran, he busted them back to Buck Private, but they had to leave one of the guns and one of the caissons and get the horses out, and they went back later and got the guns. But afterward, they called that the Battle of Who Run. Yes, sir.
What do you know about the assassination attempts on your...
Blair House, yeah. I was at Blair House in September. It celebrated 200 years of existence. And as just an aside, the story of Blair House's creation as the nation's guest house during the war, Second World War, when Winston Churchill came to visit, he stayed in the White House. And one night, Mrs. Roosevelt happened to be up, and she caught Sir Winston in his pajamas and bathrobe and a lit cigar, walking down the corridor toward President Roosevelt's room. And she said, "Where do you think you're going?" "Well, I have to confer with the president." "No, you don't. It's 1 o'clock in the morning. Get in." And after that, she went to FDR the next day and she said, "We need someplace else to put Winston." And that's how the beginning of Blair House came about. But yeah, I was there, and they took me up so we could all tour the house during the program. And I went upstairs, and it is now a sitting room, but it was Grandpa's bedroom. He was taking a nap that day when 2 Puerto Rican nationals, Oscar Colazzo and Griselio Torresola, shot their way toward the White House, killed Officer Leslie Caulfield of the White House Police. Caulfield, in turn, killed one of them. I think it was Torresola. And they were shooting going on, and apparently Grandpa stuck his head out the window to see what was going on during the shooting. He opened that window. They showed me the window where he stuck his head out, and of course they said, "Get back in." And apparently, had Colazzo gotten any farther, he wouldn't have lived. There was a Secret Service agent inside the front door with a Tommy gun aimed at the door, so he wouldn't have gotten any farther. But yeah,
1 or 2 attempts.
One attempt. Only one attempt, one serious attempt on his life. Yes. Folks, oh, yes.
I have a little quirky question. This is something I heard not too long ago. Apparently, after your grandpa died, your grandmother used to go to Stevenson's apple farm and met friends of hers there to have dinner. And I guess there was a particular drink that she liked to drink that they knew about. And apparently, she had some kind of a code word that she used when she went there to order it. And they knew what it was. Have you heard that story? Is that true?
No. And my grandmother did not use code words when she wanted a drink. In fact, there's a good story, and now I will leave you with this one. 2 stories about my grandmother and bourbon. The first one is somebody walked up to her and said, "Mrs. Truman, is it true that you pour bourbon down the throat of your Thanksgiving turkey to tenderize the meat?" And my grandmother said, "That is ridiculous. We pour the bourbon down the throats of our guests and they just think the turkey's dead." And the other one is first night in the White House, my grandmother ordered an old-fashioned, which was her drink of choice. And she drank it, but she didn't like it. And word got back to the head usher. And so the next night, he served her a different recipe. And she took one sip and said, "I'm sorry, that's still not it." And he said, "All right." And he went back to the bar, and he tried a third recipe. He put it in front of her, and she took a sip, and she said, "That's not it, I'm sorry." Now he's a little frustrated. So he goes back into the bar one more time, puts that glass aside, gets a fresh glass, puts ice in it, pours straight bourbon over the ice, takes it out and plunks it in front of my grandmother. And she took a sip and she went, "Oh, now that's an old-fashioned." Ladies and gentlemen, you have been a great audience. Oh, that's nice. Do we have pictures? There we go.
Got some pictures. The President General of the National Society, Daughters of the American Revolution, has sent this to give to Clifton today in appreciation for all of his work preserving the history of his father. And we're very grateful to her and very grateful to you.
Thank you.
And this is for you.
And Christine's going to have to send it to me because she showed it to me last night, and I said, you obviously have not seen how big my luggage is. Go ahead.
Thank you for your lovely presentation. Thank you, Christine, for arranging this. Color guard, please retire the colors. Sorry.
All right, Henson. Mark. Present arms. Order arms. Retrieve national colors. Retrieve remaining colors. Try color. Right face. Forward march. Watercolors, life-size chart.
There are refreshments at the entrance of the library. I think the door when you first come in, everybody's welcome to help themselves, come and visit for a little bit. We really appreciate the Truman Library allowing us to be here today, and we really appreciate our guest speaker for being here today and giving us such fun stories. Thank you.